Okay, so today we're going to dive into something pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
We're going to take a look at the story of Prophet Isa,
Peace be upon him.
peace be upon him.
Or, as many people know him, Jesus. And we're going to go deep into this.
Right.
We've got a great source here. A really detailed lecture by Dr. Othman Alchemies.
Yes.
And we want to figure out, like what is the story here?
Yeah.
What happened?
Yeah, what's the core of this narrative?
Yeah, what was the context that he came into and all that stuff. And you're here because you want to know, what happened
Right.
quickly and thoroughly. So that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, that's our goal here.
Yeah, we're going to give you all the good stuff, all the essentials.
Absolutely. So we're not going to get bogged down in theological debates or anything like that.
No.
We're going to look at the key events,
Right.
the circumstances surrounding his life.
Yeah.
We want to make sure you really understand this important historical and religious account.
Okay, perfect. So let's get into it.
Let's do it. The deep dive kind of follows a clear path here.
Yep.
First, we're going to look at the society of Bani Israel
Right.
before Jesus came on the scene.
Uh-huh.
Then we're going to look at the Injil like the gospel as it is today.
Yeah. Okay.
Then we'll talk about the miraculous birth of his mother, Mary,
Yes.
and the early events in Isa's life leading up to his prophethood, his miracles, the challenges he faced, and everything around how he left. And finally, we'll touch on what happened afterwards and all the different perspectives.
Exactly.
So where do we begin with all this?
Well, I think to really understand Isa's mission, we have to look at the world he was coming into, right?
Yeah.
The environment he entered.
Yeah.
And the lecture talks about a pretty significant deviation, within the Bani Israel after Prophet Musa,
After Moses.
after Moses.
Right.
And this wasn't a sudden thing.
Okay.
The source kind of points to an inherent tendency to go astray.
Right.
Even back in Musa's time, there were already, instances of disobedience.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and it seems like this inclination just kept growing stronger.
Yeah, definitely.
The lecture breaks down the leaders of Bani Israel at the time into 5 groups.
Okay, 5 categories.
Yeah, and none of them seem to be actually focused on their spiritual responsibilities.
Right.
So first you had the Siddiqian,
Interesting.
and the name itself implies truthfulness, right?
Yeah.
But it seems like they were more into worldly pleasures.
Indulging in desires, huh?
Yeah, it kind of paints a picture of hypocrisy at the highest levels.
It does.
Yeah, then you've got the Pharisee.
Okay, the Pharisees.
Yeah, and they're putting on this show of being super ascetic,
Outwardly very pious, right?
Yeah, but behind the scenes, they're exploiting people for their wealth.
Oh, wow. So using religion for personal gain.
Exactly, yeah. And then there's the Rabban, the monks.
Okay.
And the lecture says they were largely misguided in how they were worshiping. They were super rigid in their practices,
Okay.
And the source points out that these practices weren't even divinely ordained.
So they were kind of making things up as they went along.
Yeah, it even mentions a verse from the Qur'an about monasticism.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they invented it themselves, basically.
That's a pretty big deviation.
Yeah, a major departure from the original teachings, for sure. Then you have the Kutaba, the scribes.
Okay, the scribes, what were they doing?
So they were responsible for writing the Torah, and religious rulings and stuff.
Important job.
Huge job.
Yeah.
But the lecture suggests that their main motivation was worldly gain.
Oh, so not really for the sake of faith.
No, it seems like they were more interested in personal profit than genuine faith, which, raises questions about how they were interpreting everything.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And then last but not least, you have the Kahana, the priests.
Okay, the priests.
And according to the lecture, it seems like they were taking advantage of poor people by encouraging them to make vows that would benefit the priests themselves.
Wow. So they were really just serving their own interests.
Yeah, it paints a pretty bleak picture,
It does. It sounds like a society in deep trouble.
Exactly. Yeah, morally and spiritually, they were in a bad place.
So imagine stepping into that environment as a prophet.
I know, right? What a challenge.
It really sets the stage for the kind of message Isaiah brought.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the lecture then goes on to quote some verses from the Qur'an.
Oh, okay. Which ones?
From Surah at-Tawbah and Surah an-Nisa.
I see.
And these verses basically condemn all these things we just talked about.
Like the unjust consumption of wealth.
Exactly.
The hypocrisy of the religious leaders.
Yeah, all of it.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah, it really emphasizes how far they had strayed. You know?
Right.
So basically, Isateen arrives in a society that was filled with disobedience, immorality, and a religious establishment that had completely lost its way.
A real mess.
Yeah, it was a mess.
It's a crucial backdrop to understand, when we think about his mission and the difficulties he would face.
Totally. And speaking of his mission,
Yes.
the divine guidance that he brought was the Injil, the gospel.
Right.
But here's the thing. If we want to understand what the gospel actually was, the original teachings of Isa Shadhon,
Yeah.
through the gospels that exist today, the lecture raises some important points.
Okay, let's hear it.
We're not dealing with like one original gospel.
Multiple versions.
Yeah, the lecture mentions over 70 different gospels
Wow, 70.
that were circulating at some point.
That's a lot of gospels.
I know, right? And out of those 5 became like the most famous.
Okay.
And then eventually only 4 were widely accepted.
Which ones are those?
Luke, Mark, John, and Matthew.
The familiar ones?
Yeah, the ones everyone knows. But there's also this Gospel of Barnabas.
Barnabas.
Yeah, that's mentioned as being rejected by some religious authority.
I see.
So just the sheer number of Gospels suggests a pretty complex history.
Absolutely, and that's where things get interesting, right?
Yeah, like how do we know what's accurate?
Exactly, and this is where the Islamic scholarly perspective comes in.
Yep.
You see, one thing that's really important in Islam is the concept of isnad.
Isnad.
Yeah, which basically means a chain of narration.
Okay.
So it's like a documented family tree for a text.
A family tree.
Yeah, you can trace it all the way back to the original source through these reliable narrators.
I get it. So you know exactly where it came from.
Exactly, and that's how we verify the authenticity of texts in Islam. But the lecture points out that these isnads are missing for the Gospels.
Oh, wow. So we don't have that guarantee of authenticity.
Not in the same way that we do for Islamic texts.
So how can we be sure what we're reading is accurate?
That's the big question, right? And according to the lecture, these isnads were lost really early on.
Early on, like when
Within 50 years of Isa's departure.
50 years, that's like a blink of an eye in historical terms.
Right. It's not a lot of time for crucial historical documents to just disappear.
Yeah, and to make things even more complicated, there are no original manuscripts of these Gospels.
So what we have are copies of copies.
Basically, yeah, they've been transmitted and translated over centuries. Who knows what changes might have happened along the way?
And that's another point. The lecture emphasizes this historical distance
Yeah.
and the lack of a direct, unbroken chain of evidence.
Uh-huh.
It all leads to contradictions and inconsistencies.
You mean like between the different Gospels?
Exactly.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
And the lecture says that because of these discrepancies, it's really hard to get a unified and coherent picture of Isa's life and teachings just from these Gospels.
So we can't fully rely on them.
That's the point the source is making.
Wow. Okay, so what else does the lecture say?
Well, it goes on to argue that the content of these Gospels doesn't really line up with the idea of divine revelation as it's presented in the Qur'an.
How so?
Well, the Qur'an states very clearly, we gave him the gospel.
Right.
So it's implying a book of divine law and guidance.
Similar to the Torah that was given to Musa.
Exactly to Moses, Asha.
But the Gospels we have today, according to the lecture, they don't really have that kind of clear legal framework.
They're more like biographical accounts.
Yeah, like someone wrote about his life.
Right, written by people who knew him or heard about him.
Not like direct revelation from God.
That's the key difference. The Qur'an presents the Injil as a direct revelation from Allah, while the current Gospels are more like historical accounts.
Okay, so there's a big distinction there.
Big distinction.
Okay, so what else do we need to know about the Gospels?
Well, there's another point that the lecture highlights as particularly interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
The lineage of Isa in some Gospels is traced back to Yusuf an-Najjar,
Joseph the Carpenter.
Joseph the Carpenter.
I've heard that before.
Yeah, and this aligns with some Jewish claims that question Maryam's chastity.
Right.
And from an Islamic perspective, it contradicts the belief in Isa's miraculous virgin birth.
Because it makes it seem like he had a human father.
Exactly. It introduces a human element to his lineage that just doesn't fit with the Islamic understanding.
Okay, so that's a big difference.
A huge difference. The Qur'an, you see, it never mentions Joseph in relation to Isa.
Interesting.
Instead, it emphasizes Isa ibn Maryam, Jesus, son of Mary.
Right.
It's mentioned 35 times.
35 times, wow.
And Maryam, his mother, is mentioned 9 times.
Okay, so the Quran really focuses on their connection.
Exactly. It underscores their interconnected narrative and the central role of Maryam in the story of Isa Gittimitchell.
It really highlights the miraculous nature of his birth.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that brings us to the different beliefs surrounding his birth.
Right. There are a few different views out there.
Like what?
Well, the lecture mentions three main ones. The Jewish claim that his birth was illegitimate,
Right.
the Christian belief that he was the son of God, and the Islamic belief that he was a servant and messenger of Allah.
And of course, the lecture focuses on the Islamic perspective.
Of course.
So let's talk about that. What does the Islamic perspective say?
Well, it starts with Maryam's status in Islam.
Okay.
She is highly revered,
In what way?
She's considered a siddiqa, meaning a truthful and pious woman,
Okay.
and a qanita, which means devoutly obedient to Allah.
Wow, so she was a very righteous woman.
Extremely righteous, and her lineage is traced back to Dawood David Uhul.
Okay, so she comes from a noble line.
A very noble and pure lineage.
That's interesting. So what about her mother, Hannah?
Right, so Hannah, the wife of Imran, she made a vow.
A vow.
Yeah, to dedicate her unborn child to the service of Beit al-Maqdis.
The Jerusalem temple.
The Jerusalem temple, exactly. And here's the thing. She didn't even know if she was having a boy or a girl.
She dedicated the child before knowing the gender.
That's how strong her faith was.
Wow, that's amazing.
And the lecture talks about her surprise when she gave birth to a daughter, Maryam.
Okay.
Her immediate reaction was to pray to Allah.
What did she pray for?
She asked for his protection for Maryam and all her descendants from Satan.
Protection from Satan?
Yeah, and this is really significant because there's a hadith that mentions that every newborn baby is touched by Satan at birth, except for Maryam and her son.
So they were protected from that very first touch.
Exactly. It highlights their unique status right from the very beginning.
That's incredible. So what happened next?
Well, the Qur'an tells us that Allah accepted Maryam.
Accepted her.
Yeah, and that she was raised in a very good environment.
Okay.
And she was placed under the care of Zechariah.
How did that come about?
That's a pretty interesting story, actually. It happened through a drawing of lots.
The drawing of lots, like a lottery.
Yeah, among the worshippers at Beit al-Maqdis.
Wow. So they literally drew lots to decide who would be her guardian.
And the reason for this whole process was because of Maryam's father, Imran.
Oh.
He was a highly respected figure in the community, and everyone wanted to have the honor of caring for his daughter after his passing.
So they made it a fair process.
Exactly. The lecture actually goes into detail about the different accounts of this lottery.
Like what kind of detail?
Well, some say they cast pens, and the pen that floated against the current was the winner.
Against the current? Wow, that's specific.
I know, right? And others say it was the pen chosen by an innocent child.
Interesting.
But in any case, it was Zechariah's pen that was chosen.
So he became Maryam's guardian.
That's right, and while she was under his care, something pretty amazing happened.
What happened?
Well, Zechariah noticed that Maryam had sustenance with her.
Sustenance, like food?
Yeah, food that he hadn't provided for her.
That's strange.
He was confused,
Yeah, I'd be confused too.
So he asked her about it, and her response was simple.
What did she say?
She said it was from Allah.
From Allah, so it was like a miracle.
Exactly. It showed her profound connection to the divine,
Right.
and that she was being blessed with provisions beyond the ordinary.
Wow, so this event really highlighted her piety
Absolutely.
and the special favor she had in Allah's eyes.
Definitely it set the stage for what was to come.
Yeah, that leads us to the Annunciation, the moment when Maryam receives the news about Isa.
The news that would change everything.
Yeah, and the lecture emphasizes Maryam's virtue and how Allah specifically chose her for this miraculous event.
It wasn't random. It was divine decree.
Right, so tell me about the Annunciation. How did it happen?
Well, the angel Gabriel Tirasan, appeared to Maryam,
Okay.
and he told her that she would give birth to Isa, the Messiah, son of Maryam.
Wow, and what else did the angel say?
He said that Isa would be honored in this world and the next, and would be among those closest to Allah.
So it was a huge announcement.
A massive declaration of his significance.
What about Isa's mission? What would he do?
The angel said that he would speak to people both as an infant and as an adult.
He would speak as an infant.
Yeah,
Wow.
and that he would be among the righteous.
So his destiny was laid out before him.
Right, from the very beginning.
So how did Maryam react to all of this?
Well, she was understandably shocked.
I
But
bet.
she questioned how she could possibly conceive a child without being touched by a man.
A valid question.
And the angel's response emphasized the power of divine will.
What did he say?
Kun fayakun bibe, and it is.
BB. And it is wow.
It's a reminder that Allah's power transcends our limited understanding of how things work.
So anything is possible with Allah.
Exactly.
And the lecture also mentions that Isa Shul is referred to as Kalimatullah, the the word of Allah.
Yes, cast into Maryam.
So his existence itself was a divine act.
Absolutely. And then the lecture touches on something interesting. King Herod's attempt to kill all the infant boys.
Oh, yeah, because of the prophecies about a future king of the Jews.
Right.
It's kind of like the story of Musa, who, and Pharaoh.
A similar pattern of rulers feeling threatened by divinely appointed figures.
Exactly. So fearing for Isa's safety, Maryam fled.
Right.
And there are different traditions about where she went.
Some say Egypt, some say Damascus. Others say she stayed in the same area, but a miraculous spring appeared to provide for them.
So the exact location is unclear.
But the important thing is that they were protected.
By Allah's will. So let's talk about the birth itself.
A momentous occasion.
Yeah, the lecture describes Maryam going to a secluded place to give birth.
Eastward.
Eastward. Okay. And she experiences pain during labor.
As is natural.
Right. It's a reminder that even amidst these miraculous events, she was still human.
Experiencing the human condition.
Exactly. And we have to remember that Isa's creation is unique in Islamic theology.
It is one of a kind.
Yeah, the lecture mentions the 4 categories of human creation.
Right.
Adam created without a father or mother.
The first human.
Then Hawa Eve from a male without a female.
And then Isa from a female without a male.
And finally, the rest of humanity from both male and female.
So his birth is truly exceptional.
Absolutely no other prophet was born in this way.
Right. And naturally, Maryam was worried about what people would say.
Of course, she was unmarried and having a child.
That was a huge social taboo.
So the lecture tells this story about Maryam talking to a relative who questions the virgin birth.
And she doesn't get defensive or angry?
No, she uses analogies.
That's clever.
Yeah, she talks about crops growing without seeds, trees flourishing without water.
Interesting comparisons.
And then she brings up the ultimate example, the creation of Adam.
To show that Allah can do anything.
Exactly. And to ease her distress, Allah provided for her miraculously.
How so?
Well, a withered palm tree suddenly produced ripe dates for her.
Wow.
And a stream of water appeared.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and she was told not to grieve that Allah was with her.
What a comfort that must have been.
Totally, and there's actually some debate about who spoke to her at this point.
Really? Who are the possibilities?
Well, some narrations say it was the angel,
Okay.
while others say it was the infant Isa himself.
The baby Isa speaking, that's extraordinary.
I know, right? It's another testament to his miraculous nature.
Right from the very beginning.
And then comes the instruction to Maryam about how to handle her community.
What was she supposed to do?
She was told to indicate a vow of silence.
A vow of silence.
Yeah, basically she wouldn't speak to anyone. It was a way to avoid immediate accusations and let a bigger sign manifest.
So it was a strategic move.
Exactly, guided by divine wisdom.
Interesting.
So she returned to her people carrying baby Isa.
And I'm sure they had a lot to say.
Oh yeah, they accused her of all sorts of things.
What did they say?
They even said, Ya Ukhta Harun, O sister of Aaron.
Now, who is this Harun?
That's actually a point of debate among scholars.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there are a few different interpretations.
Like what?
Well, some say he was her actual brother,
Okay.
a righteous man known for his piety.
So they were comparing her to him in a negative way.
Exactly, like how could she be his sister and do something like this?
Right.
But others say it was a more general reference to a righteous person from the past.
So using his name as a symbol.
Yeah, and there's even a hadith that clarifies that it was common back then to name children after respected predecessors.
So it wasn't necessarily meant to be a literal comparison.
Yeah, but regardless of the interpretation, it's clear that they were accusing her.
They couldn't believe she had a child without a husband.
Right, and they even made accusations involving Zachariah and Yusuf Najjar.
Trying to find a human explanation.
Yeah, poor Maryam, she was under so much pressure.
But then something incredible happened.
What happened?
Isa himself spoke.
As a baby.
As a baby in the cradle.
No way. What did he say?
He declared that he was a servant of Allah, a prophet, blessed and commanded to prayer and charity and dutiful to his mother.
Wow, and he also denied being the son of God or illegitimate?
He shut down all their accusations.
In the most miraculous way possible.
It was a clear sign from Allah.
So what happened after that?
Well, the lecture highlights 10 key declarations that Isa Sadaqah made as an infant.
10 declarations.
Yeah, and then it says he didn't speak again until he was older.
So that initial speech was like a definitive sign.
A testament to Maryam's innocence and Isa's divine nature.
Incredible. But that wasn't the only miracle, right?
Oh no, the Qur'an mentions several others.
Like what?
Well, Isa Sadaqah was given the power to heal the sick,
He could heal people.
Even those with leprosy and blindness?
Wow.
He could raise the dead,
The dead.
bring them back to life.
That's powerful.
And he could even create birds from clay.
Create birds.
By Allah's permission, he would breathe life into them.
That's amazing. What else?
He also had knowledge of what people ate and what they stored in their homes.
So he had like supernatural knowledge.
Exactly.
It was clear that he was a true prophet of Allah.
With undeniable miracles.
Absolutely. So what happened after all these early miracles?
Well, the lecture briefly mentions the period after that.
Okay.
There might have been a migration, and King Herod eventually passed away.
Right.
But the Quran mainly focuses on the important parts of Isa's life. The ones that are relevant to his message and his prophethood.
So the parts that matter most for our guidance.
Exactly.
So when Isa's COU reached prophethood, what was his message?
Well, he called Bani Israel back to the basics.
Like what?
The oneness of Allah.
The most fundamental principle of Islam. Exactly. He emphasized that Allah is the only one worthy of worship.
And that we should obey his commands completely.
Absolutely.
What else did he preach?
The belief in the afterlife.
Yeah.
The importance of detaching ourselves from worldly possessions.
Okay.
The value of humility, good conduct, and adherence to the Torah.
So he was calling them back to the true path.
To the straight path.
And the lecture mentions this interesting incident with his disciples.
With Al-Hawariyan.
Yes, Al-Hawariyan. They asked him if Allah could send down a table of food from heaven.
A table of food.
Yeah.
As a sign.
So they were asking for a miracle.
But not because they didn't believe.
No, they wanted reassurance.
And to strengthen their faith.
And to show others the truth.
Okay, so what did Isa say?
Well, he initially cautioned them.
He cautioned them.
Yeah, he emphasized that true belief shouldn't depend on seeing tangible signs.
I see.
But when they explained that they wanted this miracle to increase their certainty and to share it with others.
He understood their intention. He did, and he raised his hands in prayer and asked Allah to send down the table.
Wow, so what happened?
Allah answered his prayer.
He set the table down.
But he also issued a warning.
A warning?
Yeah. He said that those who disbelieved after witnessing this miracle would face a severe punishment.
So it was a test of faith.
Absolutely.
That's intense, and I've actually heard different opinions about whether the table actually came down.
Yeah, the lecture mentions that there's some debate among scholars about that.
So it's not entirely clear.
But either way, it's a powerful story.
It is. So who were Al-Hawariyun exactly?
Well, they were the devoted supporters and disciples of Isa al-Jinn.
His closest companions.
Exactly, and the Qur'an praises them for their strong faith.
Okay.
There are verses where they declare their belief in Allah and their support for Isa.
Wow, so they were true believers.
And the word Hawari itself means helper or supporter.
Helper or supporter.
Yeah, and the lecture mentions a saying of the Prophet Muhammad Ilyas.
Really, that every
One-
prophet had a Hawari. Every prophet.
Yeah, and that his own Hawari was Azubair bin al-Awwam.
Wow, so it's like a recurring theme in the stories of the prophets.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. So what else do we know about Isa's teachings?
Well, the lecture shares some wise sayings attributed to him.
Like what kind of sayings?
Things about the dangers of loving this world too much.
Okay.
And the importance of prioritizing piety.
Right.
There's the story about thieves and a mountain of gold.
Thieves and gold. What happened?
Well, it's meant to illustrate the deceptive nature of worldly wealth
Okay.
and how it can lead people astray.
Yeah.
And there's another story about Isa encountering a thief who swore falsely.
So he was teaching about honesty and righteousness.
Exactly.
But despite his clear message, many people rejected him.
Especially among the Jews.
Right.
They couldn't accept his teachings.
And they plotted against him.
They did.
They wanted to kill him.
They tried to incite the rulers against him.
By making false accusations.
Yeah, they were afraid of his influence.
But Allah protected him.
As he always protects his messengers.
So what happened?
This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, tell me.
The Islamic belief is that Allah did not allow them to kill Isa Uso.
They didn't crucify him.
No, the Quran explicitly refutes that.
Where does it say that?
In Surah An-Nisa,
Okay, so what happened instead?
Allah raised Isa Usia bodily to himself,
He ascended to heaven.
and he cast the resemblance of Isa onto someone else.
So someone else was crucified in his place?
That's the belief.
Wow. And are there any details about how that happened?
Well, the lecture mentions 3 different narrations from Jewish sources.
Okay.
One says the resemblance was cast onto the chief guard who was supposed to arrest Isa.
Interesting.
Another says it was Judas the betrayer.
I've heard that one before.
And the third says it was a devoted disciple who volunteered to sacrifice himself.
Wow, so there are a few different possibilities.
But the point is that Allah's plan prevailed.
Their plot failed. And the Qur'an says, "Indeed, I will take you and raise you to myself and purify you from those who disbelieve."
Powerful words.
Yeah, it's a clear statement that he wasn't killed by his enemies.
Allah protected him.
And the lecture also talks about the verse, "Those who follow you will be above those who disbelieve until the day of resurrection."
Right.
What does that mean?
Well, Ibn Kathir, one of the great scholars of Islam, he said it refers to the true followers of Isa.
The ones who believe in his original message.
Exactly. The ones who uphold his teachings about being a servant of Allah.
Not those who elevated him to divine status.
Right.
And the lecture also mentions that El-Istihyu, Susyu, will be questioned by Allah on the day of judgment.
About what?
About whether he ever claimed to be God or asked people to worship him and his mother.
That's a crucial point.
It emphasizes the absolute oneness of Allah.
Yeah.
And that no one should be worshipped alongside him.
Exactly. And it reinforces the idea that true followers of Isa are those who stick to his original teachings.
The ones that affirm his role as a prophet and messenger.
Not the ones who distorted his message.
And the Prophet Muhammad Aegis said something really interesting about this.
What did he say?
He said that Muslims are more entitled to Musa and Isa than those who distorted their messages.
Wow, that's a powerful statement.
It highlights the continuity of the message of monotheism.
From the time of Moses to Jesus to Muhammad, peace be upon them all.
So let's talk about Isa's ascension.
Okay.
The lecture tells this story from Ibn Abbas
Okay.
about Isa having a final gathering with his 12 disciples.
Before he left.
Yeah, and he tells them about the betrayal that's coming.
The plot to kill him.
Yeah, and how Allah will protect him by casting his resemblance onto someone else.
So he knew what was going to happen.
It seems so.
And then what?
He ascends to heaven through a window in the roof of the house where they were gathered.
Wow. Right in front of their eyes.
And after he left, 3 different groups emerged among his followers.
3 different groups.
Yeah, representing different interpretations of who he was.
Okay, what were they?
So one group, the Jacobites, they claimed that Isa was Allah.
Okay.
Another group, the Nestorians, they believed he was the son of God.
Right.
And the third group, they held on to his original teachings.
So they believed he was a servant and a messenger of Allah.
Exactly. And the lecture says that this group is the closest to the Islamic understanding.
Okay.
And it also mentions the Gospel of Barnabas.
The one that's not accepted by the church.
Yeah, it apparently says that Judas was the one whose appearance was changed.
Interesting.
And that Isa was raised to heaven.